Hey there folks, Rel here. This episode we're going to be talking all about the Engineer turret. So we're going to be talking about not only the strategies and uses of the Mana turret, but also the physical properties of the turret themselves. So regardless of which faction you're a part of, this episode will have something for everyone. Before we delve into the strategy of turrets, I want to talk about the strengths and weaknesses of each one. The differences between turrets aren't massive, but I thought that for the sake of being thorough, I'd mention it. The Terran Republic's turret is probably the least visible in the game. I say that because the other two shine like beacons, whereas this one is a little bit easier to pass over, especially during the daytime. Terran turrets have shielding that is very up and down. The head is covered pretty well, and the turret legs are too. So it's a bit more difficult for enemies to pull off headshots on a manned turret, especially if the gunner is swiveling. If I had to rate the visibility, just in comparison to the other two turrets, I would say visibility is low, headshot coverage is high, vertical coverage is high, and horizontal coverage is low. NC turrets strike the middle ground as far as visibility goes. They have the best horizontal coverage and good coverage at the base of the turret as well. Where it's lacking is in the head protection. It'd be a lot easier to get headshot on a NC gunner than one using a VS or TR turret, and there are a number of places that the turret is susceptible to damage, and it probably has the most weak points, I guess, of any turret in the game. But ultimately, when an enemy is hitting the turret instead of you, it's a pretty good day. If I had to rate things, visibility is moderate to high, and headshot coverage is lowest, vertical coverage is moderate, and horizontal coverage is high. Vanu Sovereign turrets are probably the most obnoxiously bright turrets in the game, and their shield color matches their secondary instead of their primary like every other faction. If the shield was purple, it'd definitely be less visible, but a big obnoxious green shield is a pretty small price to pay for having the most coverage in the game. Vanu gunners are the most difficult to get headshots on from the front because the slot is just so small, but there's also a lot of horizontal coverage in the form of these side fins. Visibility is high, headshot coverage is high, vertical coverage is high, and horizontal coverage is moderate to high. But all in all, my favorite turret actually belongs to the NC, and that's because it suits my playstyle very well. An engineer should never be tied down to their turret. It's a tool with many uses, and one of those uses is cover. While it might seem like a drawback to have the least head coverage, it's also an asset. The NC turret gives you the perfect amount of shielding to fire through and around the turret while keeping yourself out of harm's way. Firing through the turret is a lot more difficult with the other two turrets because of that really extensive head coverage. But more on strategy later. A couple of things I want to mention about the Mana turret are: you can deploy an ammo pack instead of the turret by pressing the B button, so that's just switching to an alternate fire, and you'd actually be surprised how many people don't know that. The turret actually fires lower than your sight line, so you have to remember to compensate for this, and sometimes it's pretty impossible to do so. The turret does decent damage, and it can also damage light vehicles like fighters and flashes, but not tanks, sunderers, liberators, etc., etc. And I apologize for not having the specific numbers on this, and if you do happen to know them, please leave them in a comment below. That would be extremely helpful for me and everyone else. The first few shots are accurate, but it loses that accuracy bonus very, very quickly. It won't stop a rocket. The shields are good, but they're not that good. And it renders further out. So like vehicles, turrets will be visible or load into the game further out than regular infantry will. This isn't a huge thing, but it's something to keep in the back of your mind. The biggest thing about the turret is that it takes 2.5 seconds to deploy and then another half second until you can actually jump in the gunner seat. That's after it's set up. So there is also a slight delay from when you click to place the turret until it'll actually drop. In other words, it won't drop the instant you click the button, and the most reliable way to actually set a turret down in a green lit area is to actually hold the mouse button down after you click it, and it'll prevent you from canceling it early, which is something that I'm sure we've all run into. The last thing I want to mention about the turret itself is that it has infinite ammo, and I'm pretty sure all of us are aware of this, that it uses a heat bar instead of finite rounds, but the certs for the turret allow it to fire longer before overheating. I don't ever suggest putting your points into this, and if you do find a use for it, hey, good on you. But very, very rarely have I actually found myself in a situation where I've been sitting in a turret long enough that it overheats. But if you often find yourself in those situations where your gun is too hot and that's what gets you killed, then by all means put the certs in. I just don't think that it's worth it. And that'll about bring us into the strategic part of things. Like I mentioned briefly earlier, you can't be chained to your turret. A turret is a big glowing target for sniper rifles and rocket launchers, so sitting in a turret for a long period of time is generally a bad idea. Very specifically, there are three main uses for a turret: ambushing, cover, and distraction. I'm going to cover each element separately, then I'll talk about the general tips and strategies for it. So when I say ambushing, I'm referring to how useless a monoturret is in a stand-up fight. It's just very easy for a gunner to get taken out when they're sitting in a turret, especially if you're out in the open and people can flank you easily. So the most effective way to use one is to keep it out of line of sight initially. So essentially that's the first tip, is keep your turret out of immediate line of sight. When an enemy turns a corner and then sees you, they don't have time to line up a proper shot, which they need to do to avoid the protective shield. So therefore you have the advantage. Good ambush spots are basically around the corners from high traffic areas. So spawn points, staircases, and pretty much anywhere the enemy won't already have you in your crosshairs. And if you read the forums at all, you'll probably see a lot of people talking about using the monoturret for cover. And usually it's attached with some complaining about how useless the turret is, etc., etc. And they're right to a degree, at least about the cover part. A turret isn't always the most useful when it's being fired. It's a great way to soak damage, especially if you can supplement with additional cover like in this clip here. So you'll see that I have a pretty sizable wall of cover thanks to an enemy turret and one of my own. A landmine is in the room to my right, so I can't get snuck up on. The turret itself has a pretty sizable hitbox, so even if you don't have the shield facing an enemy, you can still use the turret's body to potentially sponge up some bullets for you. And remember that turrets aren't just cover for you, so they persist until they're destroyed or until you place a new one. So even if you're off doing something else, a turret can be a good cover for an ally. So finally, the most entertaining use of a turret is as a distraction. It's a bright, glowing object that for whatever reason, people are just really tempted to shoot at. So if an enemy shoots at your turret, you'll see their location on the radar, or at the very least you'll hear where they're coming from. If they're a heavy assault and they're using a rocket and just blasted your turret, then you know that they'll have to sit through a long reload, and that's something you could take advantage of. But even if they're not stupid enough to take a shot at an empty turret, then there's still huge advantages to think about. An example is if you're camping a room, stick a turret at the opposite of where you are. So when an enemy walks through the doorway, they're likely to notice the glowing turret first instead of the guy crouched in the corner. And this gives you an advantage, if only for a moment. In this clip, you're going to see me place a turret on one side of some rocks. Now note that the enemies are sitting in their spawn, kind of pinned down, and they can actually see this turret. And they're more likely to avoid moving toward the turret, even if they happen to notice no one is in it. So instead you'll see people trying to flank me. They'll be moving around and I'll kind of be waiting for them there. So even if you're not behind the turret, it can be a pretty good scarecrow. Alright, so general strategy in the form of some pretty quick tips. Always try to keep a turret up somewhere unless you are trying to be stealthy, because even if you're not using it, someone else might use it for cover. When you're putting up a turret, remember that it takes 3 seconds before it becomes active and usable. So if you're dropping one in the middle of a firefight, don't do it out in the open. Drop it near some cover so you can keep from getting killed while it's deploying. Try to keep the engagements at medium to long range if you're manning the turret, but focus more on using it as cover for close range situations. When you're getting outclassed from range, deploying a turret as cover might actually save your life, at least for a while. In this clip you'll notice enemies taking pot shots at me out in the open, and it's a pretty bad situation for me, but I drop a turret to get some cover and then I try to take out the enemies at range. I made the mistake of using the completely oblivious lightning tank as cover because I couldn't keep up with him, and then I die and whatever. If you're gunning a turret, try to burst. Accuracy goes really bad really quickly, so just remember to burst and it'll help you keep your weapon from overheating. Use mines to cover your rear end. If you set up a turret and are vulnerable from behind, anti-personnel mines are your best friend. Always flank your enemy during big stupid fights. You know the ones I'm talking about. You got a bunch of people grouped up in one area and they're slowly getting picked off, and then you got a bunch of enemies grouped up across the way and they're doing pretty much the same thing. So when you can, flank them and then mow them down. Putting a turret in a doorway is almost always a good idea. Cover on the left, cover on the right, and enemies have to maneuver around you to get to you. Anyway, one final thing I'd like to leave you with, and hopefully this gets fixed in the near future because it's hilarious, but you can abuse the crap out of jump pads by putting a turret on the landing zone. So when enemies fly in, they're going to splat on impact, or at the very least, take a bunch of damage, which means easy pickings for you. And there you have it, folks. If you have any strategies or information you'd like to add, please feel free to leave a comment below. And if this guide was at all useful or interesting, please subscribe and like the video, and have your friends do the same. So thank you very much, folks. We're all signing off.